Hey guys, Bound to Divide here with Ableton Tips, and today I'm going to talk about mastering in Ableton with only Ableton plugins. Okay, so I just want to start off by saying that my process of mastering is really just a final loudness push and maybe like a tiny bit of gentle rebalancing and just gentle EQ moves. It's like the final 5% last push and polish of the track. Before I've mastered the track, I already have mixed it to sound exactly the way I want it to sound once it's mastered. Obviously, just it's not as loud. So if you are working on a track and you want to master it because you think the track doesn't sound good and you think that mastering is going to make it sound good, you should stay away from that process of thought and just make sure that you're working on the mix and getting the mix sounding as good as possible, and you should be referencing already in the mixing stage, not only in the mastering stage. Okay, and another thing is that typically when I've seen mastering tutorials in the past, people have a pre-master loaded into their DAW and they're kind of mastering a file as if they're doing it for a client and they're a mastering engineer. But typically people that are looking for mastering tutorials on YouTube are not mastering engineers. They are bedroom producers who have access to the entire project. And so anytime you find a problem in your mix, say for instance, the track is too boomy and bassy, you shouldn't be sitting there on the master and trying to EQ the bass. You should go back into the project, find your bass channel and turn it down or EQ the bass. Every problem should try and be solved as close to the root of the issue as possible. Okay, so in saying that, let's go through my mastering chain. Right, so the first thing I do when I'm mastering is I like to just push the signal as loud as possible before it starts to distort and see how loud I can get it without doing any other moves on the master. And if the track is like getting super loud already, I know that the mix is good and well balanced and there's probably not too much work for me to do on the master. So what I do to measure loudness is I use this plugin called SPAN, and I know we are only really supposed to be using Ableton plugins because this is an Ableton Tips channel, but Ableton doesn't have a LUFS, LUFS readout, and if you don't know what LUFS is, I suggest googling it and just reading about it, but it's just a measurement of loudness, and I believe it's the most accurate measurement. So I use SPAN, which is a free plugin, you can download it, and here under metering I just click on dBFS and then choose LUFS SL. And then when I play the track, you should see here the loudness readout. Typically I'm aiming for like anywhere from -6 to -8 or maybe even -9 depending on the style of the track. If it's a more mellow, chilled out track, not a lot of high-end and mid-range information, you're going to struggle to get it loud. But those are the general numbers I'm aiming for, and I'm also going to be checking my reference and seeing how loud that is and maybe trying to like closely match the loudness to that. Alright, so the first plugin I'm going to enable here is this Glue Compressor, and I'm using it almost like a limiter. It's what we're doing is we're soft clipping the signal, and soft clipping is just basically we're going to be pushing the signal up over 0 dB, and then it's going to hit the soft clipper, and that can create a nice sort of saturation and also get the track nice and loud while retaining its nice like punchy dynamics. And how we do that is we just turn on soft clipping and we don't touch the threshold. We're not using the actual compressor, we're just using the clipper, and we just turn up the makeup gain until that clip light starts going, and then we know we've hit 0 dB, and I like to push it and see how loud I can go before it distorts and then kind of back off from that point. Okay, so at 14 it's starting to distort a little bit, so I'm just going to back off like 3 dB, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so the track is already hitting like -10, -9, and I just want to compare it to the reference track quickly and see how loud that is. Okay, so this one is hitting like -8.5. And I'm also, when I switch between them, I noticed that this track sounds a little more open, like the high end is a little more high end, it's a little brighter, and the bass isn't quite as muddy. But there are also factors to take into consideration, like we are using different basses here. In the reference track, there's really only a sub, so there's not a lot of mid-range that's coming out of the bass. And you can see that here on SPAN when I compare the two. If you look around here at like 150 Hertz, there's a bit more of a dip here, and here we've got a bit more information. But like I said, there are two different tracks with different bass sounds, so I'm not too worried about that, but I am going to gently just give a little bit of scoop there and see if the track feels better, if it feels a little more open. Maybe the sub will feel a little nicer. So let's start making some little EQ moves here on the master. Alright, so for when I'm EQing on the master, I generally prefer to use this channel EQ. Is like the closest thing you'll find to an analog EQ, and it's always better to use these like semi-parametric EQs or like analog modeled EQs if you can. And that's because they generally have like predefined points that generally like or historically sound really good. That's why they're so desirable, and these EQs cost like thousands in their analog form. And the curves are generally really gentle, so it's difficult to make huge mistakes with these analog EQs, where if you're sitting there with an EQ8 and making these like huge, like crazy dips and notches and these crazy bell curves, quite often you're creating resonances, and for every problem that you solve, you're adding three new problems. So yeah, let's try and make some gentle moves here. You can see I've already been playing with this before, so I'll reset this and show you my thought process here. Alright, so I said that the lower mid-range felt a little busy there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce the mid-range by like 4 dB or something, and then use this control to sweep up and down and see, does the track at any point feel like a bit cleaner and a bit more open? And then once I find that point, I can kind of dial in how much I want to remove. Okay, so let's reduce that and inversely, you can also try and boost that section and feel like, does it sound more muddy? So yeah, I would say around 195 we'll do a little bit of a reduction, like a 2 dB reduction. Compare it to the reference again. And I'm just going to turn down the reference a bit so that we're not paying too much attention to the loudness at this point. More just the balance. Okay, yeah, so that's sounding better. And now the next thing I'm noticing is that the high end on the reference sounds a bit brighter. So typically this is something I would probably go back into the mix and solve by toning up the hi-hat a bit, or maybe EQing the hi-hat bus to make those hats a bit brighter. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to be doing it here on the master, which is not a big problem. I mean, this is quite a common thing to do on the master. So I'm just going to be boosting the high end here. Okay, now I just want to pay attention to the bass or the kick and just see how the kick feels in comparison to the reference. I think in both cases the kick is sounding like it's coming through the mix nicely. The reference, the kick is a little more subby, but I'm okay with that. I like the way the kick sounds in the mix in my track that I'm working on now. I don't necessarily want the kick to be more subby, and it's not like it's a huge difference. I can still feel the kick punching.
Hi, this video is sponsored by us. If you like these tutorials and want to support the channel, check out our website packed with online courses and professional sound packs. If you want to cut years of your learning curve, check the PML Beginner to Advanced Music Production program for Ableton Live. You will know Ableton inside out and learn how to write, produce, mix and master complete tracks. You learn step by step at your own speed, from an empty file to professional production, as if we're sitting side by side in the studio. Thank you for listening, and now let's get back to your tutorial.
And so another thing I'd like to do is to just check the low end without any high end. So if we just turn on this EQ8, I've rolled it off around 100 Hertz. When I listen to the sub, I want it to, I want to be able to feel the kick punching and feel some separation between the kick and the sub. So I can definitely hear and feel the kick. It doesn't feel like just one kind of boomy, muddy sound. It's defined and there's some separation there, which is good. And if we compare it to the reference, yeah, both of them kind of coming through in a similar way. Obviously, like I said, the other kick is a little more boomy and I think maybe deeper down, but overall I'm feeling that definition and separation, which is what I'm looking for. So I'm happy at the low end. I'm not going to do anything on the channel EQ here, and let's turn that off. Then I'm going to move up to this EQ8 here. So this EQ is basically just going to be rolling off the low end, everything below 30 Hertz here. And that's just because sometimes you find a bit of rumble down there, and that can come through, especially on like huge club systems. And typically I would be using a high quality EQ, not EQ8 for this, and maybe something that has linear phase mode, which preserves the phase. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can just research linear phase EQs and it'll tell you everything you need to know. But just know that I would typically not be using EQ8 for this. And I think the location that you do this in the chain is really important, because if you are doing something like soft clipping and you do this EQ8 before that soft clipper, all that stuff that you've just taken out is probably going to be coming back in, because that distortion is causing like these harmonics to build up below this cutoff point over here. So basically you'll be taking that stuff out, clipping it, and then it'll come right back in. Or at least in my experience, that's what I've found when I've tested it. So I chose to do it over here after the soft clipper. And then the next thing I've got is the saturator. So you'll see I'm doing quite a lot of clipping and saturating, because it just typically sounds a lot better than compression and limiting. So here I've got the saturator set up, only doing a little bit of a loudness push here. We're doing 3 dB of saturation. We're using this analog clip mode, and I'm balancing the input and the output so that the saturator is it's not pushing the signal too much, because it's already over 0 dB. It's going to just be kind of adding more harmonics to the track, so that's going to make it feel a little bit louder. But the actual signal is not getting that much louder. Okay, so let me just reset these. So here we just push that up 3 dB. Then we just reduce the output by 3. And then these dials are pretty important too. So here this control, this bass control, basically tells the saturator how much it should be clipping or saturating the low end. And the low end is usually the first thing to hit that clipper, so it can get pretty ugly. So I can show that by boosting this, and then it's going to be distorting that low end. So if you find you're getting a lot of distortion and you're not doing much with the saturator, you might want to try reducing the bass. Or maybe your track just has too much sub in it. And that way you'd be saturating more of the mid-range, less of the low end. Okay, and then these dials are also important. So this is a filter, and this is basically setting the frequency of the filter. And this depth tells the soft clipper how much at this cutoff point should it be saturating. So this is one way you can do things like saturating the high end of your track, and that's what I've done here. I'm saturating around 7 kilohertz, and the depth here is at 6, and I can like push this up really high to just emphasize so you can hear what it's doing. So you can hear that high end gets like really like flat now, because I'm just absolutely crushing it. But I want to back that off obviously and bring it down to where it's just doing a little bit. Okay, and then we're going to go here to this limiter, which is the final thing in the chain, and I'm going to be just turning that on and doing some very, very subtle limiting. Like I said, this limiter sounds pretty horrible. It's usually on auto release, and I don't like putting things on auto because I don't really know what they're doing. So I set the release pretty fast. What release does is it sets the time, how long it takes for the limiter to kind of back off on the gain once the signal goes below the threshold. So if it's set to 18 milliseconds, that limiter is going to reset really quickly. And you might, with these quicker settings, you often find that they distort quicker, but they also get louder. And the more gentle settings are generally a bit more forgiving, but they can also sound quite pumpy sometimes. So you just got to kind of play with them and see what sounds good. And then there's also a ceiling here of minus 0.3, and that's just because you typically get something called intersample peaks, these kind of peaks that the limiter doesn't catch properly, and they can jump over 0 dB and distort sometimes. But that's again another issue that's kind of up for debate. I've seen some mastering engineers that don't care about them because they say that these intersample peaks are so rare and they are almost inaudible. So yeah, it's up to you whether or not you want to do that. So yeah, I'm just going to push this up a bit. Okay, so I'm still hearing a little bit of distortion. I'm going to back off a little bit on this clipper here. Okay, so now I'm going to check the loudness again, and then we'll do a few more little quick moves, and then we'll pretty much be done with this. So the loudness, if I hit reset here and play, yeah, so here we see it's hitting around minus 7.9. Which is pretty much as loud as the reference track. Oh, we need to just turn that back up. Okay, and then I also want to check how it sounds in mono. And this is something that, again, you should have done in the mixdown, so I haven't really emphasized it much, but just a final check to see if anything's getting lost or if it sounds strange in mono. Yeah, so I didn't hear anything getting lost in mono. That all sounds good to me. So one final thing I like to do is to just grab this parametric EQ and just do a little sweep around the high end and see if just reducing something maybe makes it feel more open, a bit cleaner. Let's see. I'd I don't think anything that I was reducing there made the track feel better to me, so I'm not going to touch any more EQ. Yeah, so that's it pretty much. That's my mastering process. That's how I approach it, and I hope you took something away from that. It's probably a lot more simple than most tutorial guys out there are teaching, but I think this is the reality of it for a lot of professional producers out there. They're also doing really simple, gentle moves on their masters and not doing all this crazy mid-side EQ and multi-band compression. And yeah, I just typically, for all of these crazy moves that you do, you're just creating more issues in other places where you're fixing one issue in one place. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you in the next tutorial.